Well, thank you very much for the introduction and welcome to the class of 62 to Williamstown. I hope you have a nice weekend. We had a beautiful weekend last weekend for commencement. And the graduation started at 10 and ended at 12:30, and then the rain started at about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. So it was perfect. So that's our hopes for this weekend as well. But the purpose of this panel, as Mike Keating just indicated, is to discuss sort of the changing environment of the international affairs and sort of how the world looks today compared to how the world looked like when you were graduating 50 years ago. And we're using as a springboard a recent book by Fareed Zakaria, who you might know. He's on television. He has his own show called GPS. He is a sort of a noted commentator on international issues. And we thought we would use this book because it raises a number of interesting observations about the change in the international landscape. And sort of just to quickly summarize the arguments of this book is that the main argument is that though there have been monumental shifts in the politics and economics of the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Zakaria maintains that the US will continue to be a major leader in many metrics and will most likely remain so for decades. However, the American relative position is changing due to what he calls the rise of the rest, especially China and India. So instead of American dominance, there's now a diffusion of power. Nevertheless, Zakaria maintains, the United States will continue to be strong because of cultural factors. In this digital age, he says, it will be software, i.e. culture, that matters. Furthermore, because of the nature of the other powers of the world, the US will remain the default power for decades to come and will have the ability to set the global agenda. So how is this related to Williams? Zakaria points out that higher education is America's best industry. 38 of the top 50 universities in the world are in the US, and the US trains more four-year engineering graduates per capita than any other country. An institution like Williams is what will keep the US competitive in the post-American world, as he calls it. But Zakaria maintains that the biggest challenge for sort of facing the United States is not terrorism or nuclear proliferation or China, but rather America's ability to adapt successfully to a new environment, both with confidence and openness, rather than insecurity and barriers. And he talks about the three C's, the letter C, the three C's in which will be sort of imperative in this new global age. The three C's are consultation, cooperation, and then compromise. So that are sort of the basic arguments of this book, and it's interesting to think about the rise of the rest and how the world is changing. And sort of to reflect on that, I wanted to sort of start with our conversation, and starting with your fellow classmate from the class of 1962, Jay and Steve. I wanted to, if you could sort of start reflecting on your own education here and graduating and entering sort of the international arena. How did you feel that Williams prepared you for taking on the world, which you both did in very different ways?
Well, let me go first. When I graduated from Williams, I started in the banking world in New York for a short period, and then I entered the Navy. And as Admiral Clary showed on the board, I was one of those naval officers that lived in fear of his morning parade, where we'd have to stand at attention and have our boots shine that we'd spend hours on. And if we were really lucky, Admiral Clary, as the regimental commandant, would give us what did we get, a gig for that?
Blue gig.
A blue gig, right. In any event, after that, I went to, 4 years in the Navy, I went to Columbia Business School, and then I joined Morgan Stanley. And at that time, Morgan Stanley had 120 employees. Bob Henry, I don't know whether he's here yet, was also a member of the Morgan Stanley staff with me. And as luck would have it, over the next 3 years, I was assigned to start our business in Japan. So I started making trips in 1970 and was involved with our Japanese business and Asian business from then on, off and on. In 1973, I made my first tour in Japan. I lived there for 3 years, and then I went back in the middle 80s and stayed there until 1992. My wife, who's Japanese, is sitting here in the audience. And I'd also like to introduce Walt Floyd and his wife Tycho. They were in Japan for most of the time I was there, and Walter, who, if you read his biography, was a member of the CIA and did a lot of undercover work in Japan, speaks much better Japanese than I do, and is frankly has more knowledge of Japan than I do. But in any event, what I thought I would do very quickly is just give you a thumbnail sketch of Japan, which is basically a role model for how Asian nations have developed and how they've faced their relations with the United States. When I started in Japan in the 1970s, Japan was still an emerging nation, and as you know, their products were cheap, and they had a perfect, in my opinion, a perfect meld between government and business relationships. So that everything that was done in Japan or done by any business corporation from Japan was done with permission from the government, and it was a partnership that was very effective. American firms, both in the business world like IBM and in the banking world like JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley, were allowed to do some business in Japan, but it was very limited. There were many joint ventures, as you probably know. But basically, Japan controlled their destiny, and they were very effective at keeping the United States at bay. Of course, we were worried, just as we are now with China, that our currency, the Japanese currency, was too weak, and we were paying the price for that, and our debt to Japan was rising. Same exact issues we have with China now. Fast forward to 1980s, and Japan is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We're worried that they're taking over the United States. They're buying businesses in the U.S. They're basically becoming. Many of us were fearful. Not myself, but I'm saying many in our country were fearful that they were going to be even more stronger than we were in 10 or 15 years. Then the 1990s. The Japanese Nikkei Dow peaked in 1991, and it's been all downhill since then. And of course, the reason for that is China and Korea and Taiwan and the other newly industrialized countries of Asia. But basically, I think that the model that Japan set, which was a government-business partnership, stonewalling the U.S. in terms of currency issues, and protecting their businesses as they developed so that there could be no foreign competition within the country, was a model that that all the other countries of Asia have picked up. Steve?
Let me start from a rather different perspective. When I was a senior here at Williams, one of the things that got me interested in overseas work was Africa and the advent of the Peace Corps. And in going through our wonderful class book, I noted that there were 5 of us in the class of '62 who either then or eventually committed to serving the Peace Corps. There may be more, but the 5 included Eric Olson, who served in Turkey, Peter Hayes, who served in Peru, John Newton, who served in Iran, Tom Spear in Tanzania, and myself in Ghana. Eric and I and Peter started right away, and John and Tom started a little bit later. I have to stop for a minute and say I haven't been under the spotlight like this since I ran a press conference for Henry Kissinger, and I realize it takes getting used to. If I don't see you, I know you're there, and I will just assume that you're seeing me. My senior year, my thesis was a paper that I worked on with Professors Vince Barnett and Mac Brown in the Political Science Department, which was a project on the development of Ghana in a project called the Volta River Project, which was completed some years later. This involved American engineering with Kaiser Engineering, with Italian construction with Impregilo, and with World Bank funding. It was a project that, even though this was a country that was very leftist and very socialist, got a lot of American support. And the Volta River Project not only created hydropower, but created a vast interior lake in the country of Ghana, which has added to fisheries development and other things like that. So I was interested in going to Ghana. I had a great interview with a man named Franklin Williams, who had been serving with Sergeant Shriver in the early days of the Peace Corps, came here to Williams. We talked, and I said, I'd like to go to Ghana. He said, send in your application. So I did, and I got accepted into what was the second group to go to Ghana in fall of 1962. Interestingly enough, just before leaving Williamstown, I got a call from the dean. Remember Robert R. Brooks? I thought, when I returned this call, I said, what indiscretion could I have committed on eve of my graduation? It was an invitation to come to dinner at the Brooks' house. They had just come back from a trip to Ghana, and they had wonderful slides to talk about and provide me with a preview of this country to which I was then going to train and serve. Dean Brooks, by the way, 2 years later, joined the Kennedy administration and served as what we call a super cultural attaché in India for 2 years. I think it was 1963 to 1965. I did not know at the time he was going to do that. I followed later on into a post-Peace Corps career in the Foreign Service. Anyway, I went to Ghana by way of training at the University of California at Berkeley. A lot of intensive training. It was history, it was politics, comparative government, a little bit of local language facility in Chi, and a lot of Ghana education, because we were all training to be teachers. And it was a wonderful experience. I must say, intensive though it was not more so than my classes here at Williams for the previous 4 years. So I went to Ghana. I was a teacher of French and English in a rural secondary school. I did a number of different things there outside of the classroom, as those of you who will have taught in boarding school situations will probably recall. But I also had some problems to deal with that perhaps you did not. We had a corrupt headmaster. He skimmed money off the top for personal use. He didn't do any work. This was a co-ed school. He invited the girls from the dormitory down to his house in the evening. It became a very untenable situation for other members of the Ghana staff and myself as the only Peace Corps volunteer and the only American and the only college graduate on the staff at that time. I had leave after first year. I was tempted to transfer to another school where I thought there would be better leadership. But when I came back from travel in other parts of Africa, I found out that the headmaster had been sacked. That's a term that's very widely used in the British English-speaking world. He was gone, and in his place came a wonderful new headmaster with values, with honor, with leadership, and my second year really made my Peace Corps experience for me. Came back to the States, earned a master's degree in international affairs, and then took the Foreign Service exams. I had met some diplomats in Ghana, American Embassy people, and I was thinking that that was something I'd like to try. I was able to pass those exams, and after medical clearance and security clearance, I joined the Foreign Service with a career appointment, and of all things, went back to Africa, which at my request and to my wife's initial hesitation, we then had a succession of posts in Africa. Most of the countries where I served, where we served, 5 of them in Africa and 2 in Latin America, were countries that had very much wanted to change their economies from, in many cases, the colonial eras in which they had lived and worked, to much more socialism, much more government intervention and running of the economy. And this was true in every place we served except South Africa. I would say that, just to kind of conclude right at this point, that of the countries where we served, I do not feel that there has been nearly as much progress in Africa over the years. Some people say there's been a rise of Africa. Yes, some countries are democratic that were not back in the 60s and later, and they are now. But there are worrisome situations to deal with. It's a question of governance. It's a question of the quality of governance. When we went then to Chile and to Mexico, we saw a real difference. And I would say that these are 2 examples of countries that, in privatizing much of their economic structure, have really grown and I think it's evident to all of us here how that has taken place.
Thank you. So in your line of work, when you were working both in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and into the 90s, because Sakari in his book, he assigns a considerable value to what he calls culture as a key attribute to explain continued U.S. power. So in your work and experience, what was the role of culture, and how did you sort of navigate these two worlds?
Well, culture is extremely important in Japan, and the Japanese are... they put it's a meritocracy. So in the business world, the best and the brightest get to the top, and the government is filled with the best and the brightest. From Tokyo University, normally the 5 public state universities, that they have the most of the government employees. And the Japanese they've taught the foreigners how to deal with them. They have a very set process for making decisions. You've probably heard about it. Whereas in an American corporation, the CEO makes most of the decisions, or he makes it with his executive committee or his board. In Japan, the decisions are made by a large group of people, starting with middle management, and everyone has to agree before they move forward. That's an important part of their culture. They had no lawyers when we first started doing business in Japan. Fortunately or unfortunately, we brought in lawyers from the United States and changed the culture in that regard. But the Japanese were a handshake. Your word was your bond, and a handshake. That's the way they operated.
Culture for me was really working within the United States Diplomatic Service. We were all accredited to the host country and the series of host countries, but what I was working within was the culture and the traditions of first the U.S. Information Agency, and later, when that was incorporated, into the State Department. It's a bureaucratic structure. I had chosen the specialized core of public diplomacy, and for me, that was a welcome opportunity to operate both within and outside of the culture of American diplomacy. Within, because we had many different functions, many different abilities of embassy sections, political, economic, consular, administrative, drug enforcement administration, military attaches, and so on. My job was to cut across all of this multifaceted function of an embassy and be able to respond and in many instances initiate communications with the public, that is the host country public with which we were dealing, through the media, through personal contacts, through university lectures and things like that. It was an opportunity to both be part of and also be able to reach out and engage in the culture of the host country, which for me meant in many instances listening, getting to know people, getting to know where they were coming from, accepting the values that they were living by, and then comparing and contrasting them with the ones which the United States was both living by and in many instances attempting to develop in terms of the bilateral relationship with the host country.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like both of you, didn't per se get any sort of content or skill-based education here at Williams. You entered sort of these new environments and sort of adapted very quickly. You had the self-confidence and sort of the brain power to navigate these new waters that you were engaged with. That's correct. You didn't really have any hadn't taken any African politics or languages, or you hadn't taken any the Japanese language or anything. I mean, you knew French, but was it you just walked in and you were just confident that you would be able to navigate these waters?
Not quite.
A Williams graduate.
Yeah. Well, I took Japanese language lessons, nothing like Walter. Walter, how long were you in Japanese language with the state? 2 years for the State Department. If I'd known I was going to be in Japan for 9 years, I certainly would have done the same thing. But Morgan Stanley, the investment banking world, didn't have that type of foresight in those days. But certainly you learn by experience. That's the only way you could, Magnus, in a country like Japan. And after we learned, in the early days when there wasn't really that much business for us to do, we used to help American corporations with their relations with Japanese companies and joint ventures and things like that, and renegotiating issues they might have. And the biggest issue was if you ask a Japanese businessman a question that you expect him to answer to give you what his opinion is, you're not going to get the opinion. He might answer yes, and you think that he's agreed with you, but that's not the way things work. He's saying, yes, I understand what your question is, and you have to spend hours after that to get his opinion out on the table, even during that period.
I think that for me, the education that I received here gave me a lot of intellectual interests and pursuits that helped me in overcoming the culture shock that I experienced. I'm referring to my first 2 years in Ghana as a Peace Corps volunteer. There were many occasions when I felt pretty isolated. All we had were air letters to be able to send home. There was no email. There was no Skype. We didn't even have a telephone at my school that did more than get through to the capital city about 2 times a week. But I had opportunities with my students. We organized sports programs. We supervised dormitories. I had an opportunity to relate more to them. But when I had those withdrawn moments, I read voraciously the local media, lots of newspapers, the socialist country, very critical of the United States. It was a fascinating experience as a political science graduate to experience this kind of thing, but also to read up on African history, geography, and then use that in terms of being able to travel. But I must say that invariably in that country and in the other places we lived in West Africa, the phenomenon Wawa occurred more often than not. W-A-W-A, West Africa wins again.
So one of the points in Zakaria's book is that we're living in a post-American world, and now you're sort of reflecting, you're here at your reunion, and you'll be sort of recalling a lot of memories and sort of comparing how Williams is today compared to how it was, and how the world is today and how compared to how it was. So what are you convinced that we live in a post-American world, and you know, what changes have you seen sort of over the last 50 years that you think is significant that we could sort of advise our students who are interested in international careers? And what would you tell somebody from the class of 2012 or 2013 who would want to go into similar careers as yourself?
Well, having Toshiko and I have 2 children that are still college age, and one of them's in college. I mean, the educational process has changed completely from the days when we were here. We did have, believe it or not, I'm sure you've read this as part of getting ready for our 50th, but we did have the Center for Development Economics, but we didn't really have much contact with it. We saw some of the participants around town and things like that, but otherwise no contact. Today, at most colleges, a majority of the students go abroad for at least 1 semester, which makes a completely different situation. And we talked about the international news in Steve's talk. Certainly, that has changed the perspective. I think every student at Williams presumably has a pretty good feeling of what's going on in the world, and you know, has an understanding of how one acts when you go abroad and when you're dealing with a foreign country. And I think obviously that's going to be critical for the future. Japan, I gave the example of Japan because even though it's still a powerful economic nation, it's frankly in the same position we are vis-a-vis China and Korea and Taiwan and some of the other countries in Asia, and that is that it's too expensive to manufacture in Japan, and so they subcontract and farm out to China just the way we are. So it's hard to predict where Japan will end up, and it's certainly hard to predict where we're going to end up vis-a-vis China. But I think that's the critical issue for the table here, as to how that's going to play out, and whether Zakaria is correct that we're going to have a hard time. I mean, if we can't get our politics, that's just a personal opinion, but if we can't get our political situation in order, I can't imagine how we're going to compete effectively with China over the next 15, 20 years.
I would like to comment on the whole aspect of communications in terms of how countries communicate and how peoples communicate. And I would certainly, if I were talking to seniors or upcoming seniors here at Williams, I would say, get as much study as you can in terms of comparative government, in terms of area studies, in terms of languages, other than the traditional languages, which were the only ones that were really offered in addition to Russian during our time here. Communication is a very changing field. I think we all recognize this, but let me just make the point. Formal print and broadcast media coverage, as well as social media, have now become the dominant means of information distribution. Countries are using, and peoples are using, and governments are using internet. There's blogging, there's tweeting. We all know about the 24-hour news phenomenon. And news is being conveyed instantaneously across borders and former barriers. Interestingly enough, where it used to be that the media depended on government to get its information, now governments increasingly, including China, have to depend on the media in order to get their messages across. Perfect example was the young Chinese who in the last few weeks made his way out of house arrest in the provinces of China to our embassy and attracted worldwide attention. And eventually we saw the Chinese government and our government negotiate and concede. Well, what brought that about? It was this new phenomenon of social media. Governments have a decreased ability to control information than they used to have. So this opens up some very interesting additional fields where Williams graduates might be interested in working. I would just add one other thing, and I think Jay and I both would agree on this, and that is, with all of the wonderful aspects of a liberal arts education and the ability to, as a pre-med student, major in English or to take courses in art history and so on, when it comes time to train for a career, there is still training that comes, whether it is in Jay's field of banking, whether it is in my field of diplomacy. And so you have this kind of training that you can anticipate to help prepare you for these various prospects.
So maybe we should then transition to Professor Caprio. And as you might know, he was recently nominated as the top wonk for his insights in economic issues. And there are only a few people who get that title, right? I would expect you to have some sort of hat with that. But Professor Caprio is the academic director of the Center for Development Economics. He has worked both in finance, in the private sector. He's also been in the public sector in government, and now he's in academia. So it's sort of the holy trinity of economics. And I would like to, if you could maybe take sort of the ball where Jay and Steve left it in terms of Williams today and what we're doing in terms of educating the current students and the challenging environment that they are now being faced as they graduate from Williams.
Sure. Thanks, Magnus. It's a pleasure to be here, especially for somebody from the class of 1972. Fred Copeland, you might remember as admissions director, at least used to tell my class that we had some things in common with the class of 1962, but it took the college 10 years to recover from you folks before they were willing to admit a class like you again. I always wanted to find out what that meant. So some of the names among the faculty that many of you will remember from your time here, Emile Dupre, who conceived of the idea of the CDE, the Development Center, and then left for Stanford before it even opened its doors. Bill Gates, Paul Clark, Vince Barnett, John Sheehan. These were all people in economics or political science who thought that there was a tremendous need for liberal arts training, critical thinking skills in developing countries, and they pushed for the establishment of the CDE. Its main mission was to improve policy analysis in developing countries. We now have about 1,200 alumni, and I don't know if my button, I guess I can't enlarge this, but this shows by the deepness of the shade of purple, the depth of CDE students. So if you could run slideshow on that, that might help. I think it's, there we go. So what you will see is that we have all these alumni out there in 110 countries. They are deeply loyal to Williams. They operate in all different types of positions. When we had our 50th reunion for the CDE last fall, a number of, well, let me see, 2 former prime ministers, several former and 1 current central bank governor, several former and 1 current finance minister, and others came back for it. The second goal that Gates and Sheehan and others had in mind for the CDE was to really bring the world to Williams. And I think it succeeded in that in a number of measures. It gives undergraduates a very unique experience. In the last 4 years, 65 undergraduates were taking courses with the master's students at the center. I don't know in the class of 62 if any of you got to do that because it was a couple of miles off campus at the Cluett Center, but now, of course, your reunion headquarters is the CDE building, though I'm sure many here still think of it as St. Anthony's Hall. The opportunity, give you one example of this. So in the first semester that I was teaching at the CDE in 2006, I had a midterm question, and it started off, and Steve Lewis used this in his article, if any of you read that in the Alumni Review. The question started off, well, you're the prime minister in your country, and here's the situation. And so, you're the advisor to the prime minister, and here's the situation. And so one of the students wrote back, well, in my country, Republic of Georgia, I am the advisor to the prime minister. And so let me tell you how I would handle that problem. Fortunately, he had a strong ego, because I had to tell him that introduction was really the best part of his answer. But he actually, 5 years after leaving here, became finance minister in Georgia. Most undergraduate colleges would kill to have a resource like the CDE where the undergraduates can meet people like this. Indeed, even at large universities, there may be people like the CDE students at Harvard, but good luck to any undergraduate to try to get in contact with them. I thought I would read just a couple of remarks from an undergraduate. His name is Noam Yuckman. He was summa cum laude, the class of 2005. He's now a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. And he wrote a letter after he graduated about what the CDE meant to him. And just a couple excerpts. He starts off saying that when he came for his campus visit, he and his father went to some motel down Route 7 and walked to campus. The CDE was the first building they came to. They open the door. They're greeted by these wonderful smells of CDE students cooking their own food. And a student from Nepal brought him in, introduced him to people, and it was really, he said, the first hook that got him interested in Williams. And what he says was, the first difference between an undergraduate course and a CDE course is the teaching style. The course is taught both from the perspective of the professor, who usually has a great deal of experience in developing countries, and from the experience of the fellows. This was a great diversity of viewpoints on different policies, rather than merely asserting that one policy might work in one context yet fail in another. The fellows brought to the lectures, in this case it was a class on why East Asia was succeeding, their own experiences from their countries, and to try to apply it to how would it work in a very different institutional context. Another difference between a CDE course and undergraduate course is obvious, though its importance is not, he says. The fellows are vastly different from Williams undergraduates. Taking a course at the CDE opens the door to new friendships and fascinating discussions with people from many different backgrounds. And he goes on to say, it made me a more worldly person. When discussing the Angola Civil War with someone who lost family in it, when discussing Georgia's coup with people from the government, when debating anti-Semitism in the Muslim world with Pakistanis, all of these experiences make one far more conscious of international events that are too easily ignored in the Purple Valley. I believe the most important impact the CDE had on me and could have on others is that it makes Williams students better people, more capable of succeeding in and improving the world that we live in. So that's just one view of it. You can hear a lot from undergraduates in recent years where, even if they're not economics majors, they get to interact with CDE students in a foreign language. You can find discussions in the dining halls in French, Spanish, Arabic, and Russian with CDE students. We don't draw from all these countries now. We focus on the countries where a master's in economics could make a difference in improving the policy climate. So we virtually ignore countries like India, China, Brazil. We focused on the lowest income countries and also on the Central Asian countries, former Soviet Union countries, that their economics training is quite far behind. Having the CDE also helps us draw a more internationally oriented faculty. So one example, we have an adjunct professor, Mike Sampson, who spends 6 months a year in South Africa as director of a think tank there. In fact, a think tank on development issues that got an award from the Gates Foundation as the best one in Africa. And 6 months here teaching both at the CDE and teaching an undergraduate course. And because of Mike's presence here, he was able to put together a program establishing internships for Williams students in the summer or even occasionally in winter study in South Africa. So it helps to give them a very different experience. My guess is that the CDE could be utilized even much more than it is now. As I started off, the alumni are fantastically loyal. The students who are graduating last week said, please, anything that we can do for Williams, we would love to do. I had a classmate who emailed me. He was at an airport leaving, I think maybe from South Africa, to go to Tanzania. And he wanted to know if I knew anyone in Tanzania who could give him a little bit of information on the country. Well, his plane was met by the advisor to the Prime Minister. He got a perspective that I don't think that he was counting on. We can't guarantee such help to all Williams alumni traveling abroad, but I think there are ways to link up the CDE alumni with Williams alumni for some very great benefits. I also think we could do far more in a competitive world of admissions where we're competing to get the best students from around the world. If we admit somebody, say, from Georgia, where the finance minister is a CDE alum, I know that he'd be glad to call that high school student up and say, even though you're considering Harvard, Williams worked pretty well for me. And that could be an advantage that we could exploit.
Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes remaining, and we were going to open it up for a few questions. So if you do have a question, if you could state your name, and in the interest of time, if you could sort of limit commentary and more to questions. Yes, we have a gentleman.
Yeah, Steve Carl Davis.
Yeah, so the question was, to what extent did the intelligence services in the various countries you were working, what impact did they have on your work or on the culture?
In most of my foreign service career, the intelligence part of the embassy, the CIA, was not discussed publicly. They were considered to be political officers, and we just let people did their thing. When we had queries about that, we would just say, well, every country, including your own host country, embassy in Washington, will have people who are performing intelligence duties. But it was not a subject for public discussion, and it was there were occasional articles that were often inflammatory rather than helpful, but by and large, they were not creating big problems.
Well, Carl, I might add from the standpoint of Japan, first of all, Walter Floyd can answer this question much better than either Steve or myself, but in Japan, when I first went there, Vietnam, my first trip in 1970 and I moved there in 73, and of course Vietnam was very active. There were agents of our CIA out in the business world. The head of Merrill Lynch's office in Japan was a member of the CIA. One of my close friends who worked for Continental Oil was a member of the CIA. And we would see them socially, but they would have a back room where they had all their printers and intelligence communications gear. And I attended a party at Walter's house where he had CIA, he had the equivalent of other agencies from around Asia. Remember that, Walter? From Korea and some of the other countries who were all in Japan gathering their intelligence in the same vein as CIA was.
There's one way back.
Dan Crowley, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yes, sir. Yeah. So the question is, what are the questions today? Are we moving to new questions, especially sort of related, moving maybe more from a security prism to more about peace and empathy? Are we asking new questions today?
Maybe for one of the professors, don't you think? I mean,
well, let me jump in quickly, and then I'll be happy to pass this along. We're talking here, I think, about hard power versus soft power. There's a concept that Joseph Nye of Harvard has written about extensively and is now very widely, I'm sure, both taught as well as read and studied. Soft power. What is soft power? Soft power is the ability to communicate with people. It's the Fulbright program of academic exchanges. It's the International Visitor Leadership Program, where our embassies abroad invite up-and-coming professionals in a whole variety of fields who haven't had exposure to the United States to come here for usually 2 to 3 weeks to meet their professional counterparts, to have some geographic diversity, to have some home hospitality. You may remember the news coverage a few years ago of the person who is slated to become the new premier of China, who came to the United States 20 years after he was here on an International Visitor Leadership Program. Where did he go? He went to Iowa because he had had home hospitality on a farm in Iowa. Those were the people that he remembered, that he found were Americans, and that this was the kind of thing which was quite different from what we would call inside the Beltway of Washington. There are all kinds of other types of exchanges, more opportunities for American students to go overseas and mix it up with the people with whom they are living and working and studying. It's bringing more people to the United States. They don't have to be people who are persuaded that we have the answers, but to understand where we're coming from, what makes our government tick, what is our history, why do we think the way we do, and at least better understand where we as Americans are coming from.
Well, I guess all that I would add is last Friday we had class night at the CDE, and the students vote on a student to be their class speaker. And that student who was from Uzbekistan said that besides all the economics that he learned at the CDE, the most important lesson that he was going to take home was that people everywhere are the same. People want to have some basic comfort conditions for themselves, security. They want to improve the lot of their family. They like interesting choices for themselves. And he saw that as a common characteristic with all of the students, undergraduate and CDE students, that he came into contact with.
Yes, in the back.
From my perspective, we see a lot of international students coming to the CDE. Remember, the CDE students are a little bit older. The average age is maybe 27 or 28. So they almost in some ways serve as mentors for some of the international undergraduate students. But I think the international undergraduates are a tremendously positive force on campus. They're incredibly bright, hardworking, and I think they set a great example for the undergraduates, also giving them a way to learn about countries and cultures around the globe.
Yeah, currently my understanding that the international students are about 8 to 9% of the student body. They come from all over the world, and they're of all kinds of economic backgrounds. And I think the challenge that we are facing is that they have now very specific needs, especially related to visas and sort of work permits and sort of internships for the summers. So that the college has been addressing that issue. But it's also, many of them come to Williams not really knowing what a liberal arts education is. And that has also been a challenge. They think they should be studying business or engineering or dentistry or accounting, something that's very, very practical, and then they are sort of shocked that that's not here. So that's a challenge to sort of try to educate them, and for them to then to educate their families back home of what they're doing here. And of course, there are many domestic students that face this issue as well, but the international students in particular, I think, are facing this issue specifically. But they are doing, in general, very, very well. They are very, very bright. Of course, some of them have writing in English is often an issue. And I came here myself as an international student to the United States, and I had very good English, formal English. It is the colloquialism, the slang, the jokes, the sports that you don't immediately understand. But they get it towards the end, and when they graduate, they are very well versed in American popular culture, in addition to the more formal aspects. Yes, sir, over there. So, like Steve was talking about earlier, what is fascinating about the world today is the interconnectivity that we're seeing, both digitally, but also physically. That students are seeking more opportunities abroad to connect with people, and we're not going so much via governments and institutions, but people are doing it sort of on their own. And so we are conceiving of projects and initiatives that would reward and initiate a number of sort of entrepreneurial students and faculty that can capitalize on sort of new opportunities that are out there that do not necessarily follow the traditional institutional molds, but that we capitalize on these new environments that we are facing to maximize what students are really interested in, and that is to go to places, meet with people, forge connections, and some degree of exchange, that once you've made that working together, to continue that collaboration down the road. So we've been talking about art projects in Egypt, there's a winter study trip that goes regularly to Egypt and works with Egyptian artists in southern Egypt to then bring the Egyptian students here. There've been talk about public health initiatives in Central America and so on and so forth. So we are seeing this as ways to embolden and empower undergraduates, to give them the self-confidence to see the world as their oyster, as their opportunity, and that they themselves try to figure it out, because what you've been stressing is the experience of doing it rather than reading about it is what's important. Those are some of the projects that we are focusing on. And we're starting off very small. These are all pilot projects, but these are all initiatives that we hope will sort of kindle an entrepreneurial spirit and to develop a self-confidence in moving around the world stage.
I'd like to offer just an observation. A lot of us remember Professor Bob Godino during our years here, and the way in which he both taught and the way in which, after our graduation, he organized a lot of things, including the Williams in India program that existed for a period of time. And it seems to me, Magnus, that a lot of the things that you and Jerry have been talking about here really is carrying on that tradition, that mindset that I think we're all very proud of and that we can certainly benefit from more of.
Yes.
Magnus, you should have also said that you're going to head this, right? You're going to, for this Global Initiatives Fund, yes. Rob, Magnus is going to be the point man here on the campus.
Yes, at least for the next 2 or 3 years.
Oh, all right.
Yes. But we have a committee that we're working on it, and we have been thinking about projects that fit with the mission, that are manageable, that are not sort of bricks and mortar types, but that are more sort of project based, and really can be empowering and have an impact both on the students here, but also on where they are thinking of going. So I'm afraid we have sort of we're coming to the end of our time. So please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists and speakers. Thank you so much.